Ever wonder, what's underneath everything we experience? Like the foundation of how anything even appears to us in the first place.
Yeah, it's a really fundamental question, isn't it? It's one that's kind of haunted philosophy forever, right?
And today we're looking at Michel Henry, a French phenomenologist from the 20th century.
Mm.
He took that question in a totally different direction.
Yeah, definitely. For anyone who knows phenomenology like Husserl, Heidegger, those big names, Henry basically rewrites it, and he does it through this idea of the phenomenology of life.
Exactly that. So in this deep dive, we're going to try to unpack Henry's ideas, specifically how he challenged all these traditional ideas about consciousness, about intentionality. We're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Michel Henry.
It's a great entry, super detailed, and as we go through it, we'll follow Henry's own journey as a thinker, which is super insightful. Then we'll really get into this life concept, what it means in a phenomenological sense, and how different it is from everything that came before. We'll also see how that idea goes into his views on art, ethics, even politics and Christianity. So yeah, this isn't just like a little footnote in phenomenology. It's potentially a whole new way of thinking about experience itself.
Okay, so Michel Henry was born in 1922 in Haiphong, Vietnam. And then after his father died, his family moved back to Paris when he was 7. So he's got a really solid education, goes to this prestigious school, Lycée Henri IV. And then in 1943, he writes his master's thesis on Spinoza.
Oh, Spinoza. So that's interesting, right? I mean, even though he moves away from Spinoza's rationalism later, this early engagement, focusing on immanence, it sort of foreshadows where he's heading with his thinking. It's like he's always grappling with these big questions of existence.
Totally. And right after his thesis, he joins the French resistance in World War II, the Pericles division. It's kind of a heavy reminder that philosophy doesn't just happen in a vacuum, right?
For sure. I mean, seeing that kind of stuff firsthand, the extremes of what humans can do to each other, that must have shaped how he thought about life and suffering later on. After the war, though, he's back in academia. He gets his aggregation in philosophy in 1945, and then he does research at the CNRS, the French National Research Center, and the Fondation Thiers, with people like Jean Ball and Jean Hippolyte, big names. So this is all feeding into his doctorate.
Which is his huge book, The Essence of Manifestation, right?
Yeah.
Published in 1963. The Essay entry actually says it's over 900 pages long. And it totally blew away his dissertation committee. People like, wow, Hippolyte, Ricoeur, not exactly easy to impress.
It was a massive undertaking, definitely. And it's kind of wild that his second book, Philosophy and Phenomenology of the Body, came out just 2 years later, but he actually finished writing that one around 1950. It was meant to be part of the essence of manifestation at first, but it was so important on its own that it became his secondary thesis. You can see that focus on the body early on, already pointing towards the phenomenology of life he becomes known for.
So in 1960, he becomes a professor at the University of Montpellier and stays there until he retires in 1982. He could have gone to the Sorbonne, the big one. But he chose Montpellier. Maybe he liked being a bit more independent, away from the Paris scene.
Maybe. It does suggest a real commitment to developing his own ideas without all the distractions. And he was super productive there. He wrote tons of important works that really built out this phenomenology of life. Books like Marx, Genealogy of Psychoanalysis, Seeing the Invisible, Material Phenomenology, I Am the Truth, and Incarnation. Taking these core insights and applying them to all sorts of areas.
Wow. And it's not just super serious philosophy either. He wrote 4 novels. One of them even won the Prix Renaudot in 1976, L'amour les yeux fermés.
Yeah.
So he's got this whole other side to him, exploring those same big questions about being human, but in a totally different way. He died in 2002 in Albi, France, leaving behind this huge body of work that people are still debating.
Which brings us to his big project, The Phenomenology of Life, and the really important concept of transcendental affectivity. The SEPI entry makes it clear that everything he did after the essence of manifestation was basically unpacking this phenomenology. And his starting point is this critique of traditional phenomenology. He thinks it's way too focused on intentionality, that consciousness of something.
Yeah. So this is where it gets really interesting for philosophers. He's saying that focusing only on intentionality, which is what everyone from Husserl to Merleau-Ponty did, is missing something huge. He says there's this deeper level, something before intentionality, that he calls affectivity, pathos, or even just life.
Exactly. And he has a problem with what he sees as this ontological monism running through a lot of Western philosophy. Basically, it's always been about the appearing of things, beings as they show up. But he's like, what about appearing itself? It's a subtle distinction, but it changes everything.
So for Henry, the big question is, how does appearing appear? And he's got this radical answer.
Right.
it has to be self-appearing, or auto-operator. Otherwise, it's just an infinite loop. Like if something needs another thing to make it appear, that thing needs another thing, and so on, where does it end?
It's a key part of his argument. He says that intentionality just can't do this self-appearing thing because, like Sartre said, intentional consciousness is always about something other than itself. It's ecstatic, pointing outward to something transcendent. It's like a spotlight. It shines on something outside of the light itself.
So that brings us to this idea of auto-affection. This is Henry's way of talking about self-appearing that only refers to itself. He says it's invisible because we think of visible as being about intentionality, about perceiving and representing something else. This auto-affection is like the archy-revelation, the original givenness of everything.
And this is where life, as he understands it, comes in. For philosophers, it's important to get this. For Henry, life isn't really about biology. It's about this self-appearing, this pure immanence that experiences itself in this primal way, what he calls épreuve de soi, like a lived experience of yourself that's not about thinking about yourself. This immediate self-affection is what makes it possible to experience anything else, any hetero-affection. It's the ground of all intentionality.
He also calls it transcendental affectivity, right? Transcendental, like in Kant, meaning it makes everything else possible. And affectivity, because the self-experience is actually a kind of primal suffering, a souffrir originaire. It's just the raw feeling of being without any specific content.
Yeah, and it's not all bad. Joy and suffering, those are the two basic feelings of life for Henry. And they come from life being in relation with itself, always. Because life is constantly experiencing itself, it's always affected in some way. So this immanent feeling is behind the deepest suffering and the most intense joy, the sheer effect of being alive.
So for Henry, subjectivity just is this life. It's the source of every phenomenon. And it's always got these two basic tones, joy and suffering. It's very different from thinking of subjectivity as mostly about consciousness pointed outward at the world.
Definitely. And it's helpful to think about how this relates to Husserl's idea of Heile, that raw sensory stuff. Henry kind of flips the usual phenomenological order. For Husserl, Heile is formless matter that gets shaped by consciousness. But for Henry, this primal affectivity, it has its own way of appearing. It doesn't need intentionality. In fact, intentionality actually comes from this pre-intentional level.
There's a great quote from Material Phenomenology in the Seppi entry. Seeing is actualized only as a non-seeing. This non-seeing is not the negation of phenomenality, but its first phenomenalization, our life in its non-ecstatic but yet undeniable pathos. It really gets to the heart of his argument about this prior affective level of experience.
Yeah, that's perfect. And this leads him to say there's a duplicity of appearing. We have the intentional kind, which is all about difference in objects out there in the world. And then there's this affective kind, which isn't intentional. It's purely immanent, and it comes before the whole subject-object thing that we get with intentionality. It's the invisible ground of all that we see.
So the Tippy entry mentions a few thinkers who really influenced Henry. Maine de Biran seems pretty important, especially his idea of the sense of effort.
Right. Bjorn focused on the subjective experience of effort. And that really resonated with Henry's emphasis on the lived body, the way we feel ourselves from within. That's why he called Philosophy and Phenomenology of the Body essay in Biranian ontology. He saw Bjorn as someone who got that subjective first-person experience was key to understanding being. He even talked about phenomenological vitalism in his unpublished notes, though scholars are still figuring out what exactly he meant by that.
There's also Meister Eckhart and Fichte, especially their ideas about immanence and love. It seems like Henry found something in their mystical and idealist thinking that connected with this pre-intentional self-relation he was talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And he reinterprets thinkers like Marx, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Freud through this idea of life as immanent auto-affection. You can see that in Genealogy of Psychoanalysis. His reading of Descartes' Cogito as a counter-reduction, which he talks about in Incarnation, is really important for understanding his method. It's not about moving outward, but going deeper inward.
And what about Spinoza? I mean, that was his early work.
True. But the SEP entry says he moved away from Spinoza later on, especially the rationalism part. Some scholars say there's still a Spinozian influence, but it doesn't seem like he was a major source for Henry's mature thinking, which is all about affectivity, not the intellect.
And of course, you can't talk about phenomenology without Husserl and Heidegger. But the Lispy says their influence was more like by contrast. Henry was building on their work, but also arguing against it, pushing back against their focus on intentionality and being in the world.
That's it. He took what they started but went in a completely different direction, towards this idea of life as pure immanence. And then later in his work, Christianity becomes important. Which is fascinating because it wasn't like he started out religious. He said his own phenomenology of life actually led him to find something similar in the Bible.
It is interesting. The SF entry talks about this theological turn in French phenomenology and how Jenico criticized it. He thought phenomenology should stick to objects and intentionality.
Yeah, Janico wanted a more minimalistic phenomenology. But as people like Zahavi have pointed out, plenty of major phenomenologists go beyond that, exploring subjectivity and how things appear in ways that aren't just about intentionality. Henry's take on Christianity is like a radical extension of phenomenology coming from his idea of life.
So that brings us to his life in the living, his philosophy of Christianity. How does this life concept work in a religious context?
So the key is to understand how individual subjectivity comes from this life that's shared by everyone but is also totally immanent. Like Kierkegaard, he says that the me doesn't just create itself. And this goes back to that idea of autoaffection being linked to passivity, suffering that pathos. He's saying even our sense of I can comes from this more basic powerlessness of life, the way it's always being affected.
And that's where transcendental birth comes in. Subjectivity doesn't begin out in the world, but in this immanent autoaffection, in the movement of life itself. The Set-P entry quotes him saying, in the world and in the externality of its outside, no living is possible, which is a big statement about where being comes from.
It is. So for Henry, the kind of life that can create this ipseity, this selfhood, is absolute life, is a life that's bigger than any individual. When the I is given to itself in that immanent autoaffection, that's when we become subjects. And when absolute life creates individual life, it's also creating itself in the form of ipseity. And in his Christian thinking, absolute life is God. And Christ, as the first living premier vivant, is like the original form of ipseity, the arche-ipseity.
It's all like a transcendence and immanence, right?
Yeah.
Absolute life affecting itself through each person, but within this immanent autoaffection. He talks about a participation in this absolute life, a connection on this level of feeling.
Exactly. And he says there's autoaffection in a strong sense, which is about absolute life, and a weak sense, which is about us. And the relationship between them is like sonship, filiation. It's not just a one-time event. It's always happening. We are sons of absolute life, always caught up in this self-creation of life. But we can forget about this connection, get distracted by the world.
Now let's talk about aesthetics. Henry wrote about how his phenomenology of life applies to art. Books like Seeing the Invisible, on Kandinsky, and a bunch of interviews. What's his big idea about art?
He says art creates new ways for us to experience things. It reveals the possibility of world, this pure appearing that brings things into visibility. It shows us the original way things appear, which we usually miss because we're so focused on the world. He agrees with Heidegger that art reveals something original, but he disagrees that it's the world as Heidegger meant it.
So for Henry, what art shows us isn't the world out there, but life itself, that immanent self-appearing through autoaffection. He says things like temples and cathedrals, they were first about worship. The beauty part came later. That original appearing was already linked to the divine.
He even talks about the Greek gods this way. Dionysus is the first god, for him the god of desire, life with all its suffering and joy. He's the opposite of Apollo, the god of light who wants to escape all that. Henry, especially after reading Kandinsky, thinks art is about intensifying life, this auto-affection.
And Kandinsky is really important for him. He sees him as the first artist who said art comes from this transcendental life. Kandinsky said color is a radically subjective impression, an inner resonance. And Henry connects that to his idea of duplicity of appearing. The color we see out there comes from a deeper, invisible, subjective feeling.
Exactly. So painting isn't about copying the world, it's about expressing how you feel inside. Even if it's abstract or figurative, the colors are chosen for their emotional power. And shapes aren't just shapes, they express forces that we feel in our bodies. For Henry, both painting and music are trying to express not the world, but the ground of being and of life.
Music, too.
Yeah. He follows Schopenhauer in thinking that music directly expresses affectivity. It's a force outside of representation, a pure expression of force outside the world, which is why it's abstract. He interprets Schopenhauer's will through his own idea of life as autoaffection. The body is like the most direct expression of this will, this life.
The Sepp entry also mentions that he applies this framework to other art forms, too, even if he doesn't go into as much detail.
Right. So architecture, he says, it expresses the interplay of forces. Dance, because it doesn't have to represent anything specific, shows us the possibilities of movement that we feel in our own bodies. Literature isn't something he fully developed, but he saw it as a way to express and intensify pathos. Language can reveal the affectivity that's behind the things we see in the world, which is how we get things like imagination. He even talks about a certain kind of writing as being quasi-performative, like it's pulling back a curtain to show us effective reality.
So for Henry, art is basically the most essential life coming into being. And because of that, it's also an ethical oeuvre. So let's move on to his ethics and political philosophy.
All right. So his ethics is what you could call an ethics of affectivity. It's about unmasking and overcoming our forgetting of what life really is. He says art is ethical in itself because it's connected to life's self-growth, auto-accroissement, and that original bond we have with absolute life. So ethics is like a reminder, religio, which originally meant bond, of this connection that we often forget.
And he's pretty critical of today's culture. He calls it barbarism. But he's not just talking about violence or cruelty. It's more like real culture has been flipped upside down. We're not meeting our need for self-growth, and we've lost touch with absolute life. And he blames a lot of that on science and technology, that Galilean way of thinking.
Yeah, he sees this Galilean principle of objectification as the opposite of immanent affectivity. Science can be a part of culture, but when it turns into an ideology that says only the measurable stuff is real, that's when we get barbarism. It's like his critique of monerism. We're only looking outward, not at the subject. And this leads to practices of barbarism that hurt our subjective capacities, things like being bombarded with meaningless images on TV, which stops us from really thinking. It's all about running away from experience and into these anonymous systems.
He even connects this to Kierkegaard's idea of despair. He sees barbarism as the ultimate despair, rejecting life because we want to escape the suffering that comes with it. But he thinks it's impossible, a kind of madness that defines our times.
And then there's Christian ethics, which for Henry is about recognizing absolute life. Real cultural change is like a second birth, and it has to be religious. We have to give up this self-centeredness and find absolute life again, live from its love. It's a movement towards recognizing absolute life. A second birth that happens through actually doing things, especially acts of mercy where we forget ourselves to help life flourish. And this change comes from the force of life itself, not just from our decisions.
So his political philosophy is about how we've forgotten that life is the basis of all our systems. Politics, economics, everything. He thinks things like techno-scientific capitalism and totalitarianism are extreme examples of how systems become detached and start imposing their own rules on life because we've forgotten where they came from. His ethics of affectivity aims to expose this in politics and economics to try and reverse what's happened.
He says there's a tension in democracy between our inner life and the public world. Democracy doesn't always mean good culture, and it can end up focusing only on what's visible, forgetting the life it's based on. It can be like the ego's illusion, but on a bigger scale. And if we lose that fundamental religious bond, he thinks we put human rights at risk because we reduce people to just things that can be measured. He says absolute life, which everyone shares, is the ground for an invisible community, which makes politics about mediating between this deeper level of life and the public world.
So Michel Henry definitely offers a really unique and challenging perspective in phenomenology. This idea of life as this basic pre-intentional part of experience has been a big deal for the field. It makes us rethink what consciousness and being are all about.
Absolutely. As philosophers, what we can take from Henry is this questioning of the idea that consciousness is mostly about the outside world. He makes a really strong case for this inner effective ground of being as the condition for everything else. It's a huge shift in perspective.
It really makes you think. If we take Henry seriously, how would we understand things like emotions, the body, even the self? What if we put this immanent life first instead of focusing on what's external? And could his phenomenology of life help us understand things like technology, culture in the digital age, even spirituality? There's so much to explore here.
For sure. And if you want to go deeper, definitely check out Henry's major works like The Essence of Manifestation, Material Phenomenology, and I Am the Truth. But the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Michel Henry is an amazing place to start.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.